Hi, Caleb. I'm so happy that you joined me here today.
Thanks for having me, Melanie.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit. You and I have been working on a project, which I don't know if we're allowed to talk about just yet. I'm sure she probably wouldn't mind, but we've been collaborating some as a three-person team. And as part of that, I've known your books for a long time, from my time at Photo Eye, the books of your work. And then some of the one I know you've been a designer, we've kind of bumped into each other, especially at online portfolio reviews during the COVID times. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of your work, the books that you've designed, a little bit about the design process, and what, photographers, if they're going to work with a publisher, the role that the designer has kind of in that, or the role the designer has if they're doing some self-publishing. So if you wouldn't mind just starting out, just give a little bit of background about yourself.
Yeah, so I grew up in Colorado beneath Wilson Peak, which is what they use on the Coors commercial for the longest time. I don't do it here, but I love that mountain. It's a beautiful mountain. And I guess I've always sort of loved books. And one of the first books, my undergrad was in poetry. So one of the first books that I did when I was, I don't know, 14, 13 years old was a chapbook of poems and had a very simple design, but it kind of had two covers. Part of it was blue because it was called Holding the Sky. And so one cover was holding the other, if you would. The blue was holding, I think it was like a grayish. Yeah, so I don't know, something about the objects. And I think it's such a, it's this fully contained idea that can happen in a sequence and across a certain amount of time. And I think it's pretty fascinating. And in terms of for photographers, it's really one of the perfect mediums because of that level of control that can go into it. And it's a really well-rounded idea because it often includes, a lot of it's about the distribution of text and images and how those two things relate. And of course, the visual language surrounding it. And so in a way, it's much more complex than many exhibits. And they also last. They have a much longer life than an exhibit, which I think is also really nice. And they can be passed on, which is sort of wonderful from one person to another. And they can be found at thrift shops, and they can be found, all over the place. In Park Slope, I live in Brooklyn now, and people put out their books just on the sidewalk. And so you walk down the sidewalk and you find this wonderful, I don't know, photo book or novel, which is sort of a nice way to come across something that you might not otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what about some of your books? Tell us a little bit about the books that you have done of your work.
Yeah, so I was, I guess, well, the first book was all black and white. I was shooting film, 6/7, Silent Aftermath of Space, and had a very, very short introduction by Robert Frank. And then the next one was A Portrait of Ice, and I think that's sort of what became a little more prominent. It was like large-scale photographs of ice, mostly sky, so maybe 2/3 to 3/4 sky on the top, and just sort of the glacier across the bottom. And yeah, it was a lot of fun because it got me into the mountains, which, as I said, I grew up in the mountains, and I've been living in New York, so no mountains here, only skyscrapers. So it was an excuse to be in the nature, and the ice is such a different landscape because most of us, maybe we're familiar with the desert or the ocean or the forest, but not so much the ice. At least I hadn't been. And it's a very different ecosystem and environment.
Yeah. Did you publish those yourself, or who did you work with?
Those were by Damani, who's an Italian publisher, who I later went on to design some of their books as well for other artists, and sort of acted as a roving acquisitions editor for them for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. And then a lot of people, I'm sure, would probably want to know how you got in touch with Robert Frank to get him to do a...
Oh, yeah. So I met him through another photographer. So I also have printed for a lot of these sort of the generation beyond mine of photographers. So I've done work for Mary Ellen Mark, for Ralph Gibson, Donna Ferrato, Robert Frank. I've printed some of his old contact sheets with the red circles around them. So I met him through another photographer, Dodo Jinming, who I was helping her try to transition from darkroom prints to digital pigment prints. Yeah, so.
And then you said you started working with Damani for design. What are some of the books that what are some of the books that you've designed in general? Do you have a few that are there by your side right now? And do you
yeah, so
those?
Yeah, so let's see. I mean, recent stuff, COVID really destroyed the production line tremendously in so many ways. I mean, the paper is, aside from price increases, the paper is a disaster. Sometimes you have to wait like 2 months to get paper. So there were a bunch of spring books, 3 spring books that were supposed to be out in like, I don't know, February, March, April. And they're just starting to come out.
Shipping was just crazy. It seemed like it took forever to get.
It was so crazy. So they're just coming out now, or some of them haven't even hit the shores yet, but the advanced copies are here. Because also shipping seems to be taking longer. So let's see. Yeah. So I think with the design process,
yeah, how did you get into, just let me interrupt you, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm gonna make it organic. How did you get into being a designer?
I mean, so COVID hit, I'd been designing maybe 1 book a year, 2 books a year, but I didn't really think, I mean, I enjoyed working with other photographers. As I said, I've always loved books and creating the books, but I didn't really think of myself as like a designer. It was just something that I did sometimes. And then COVID hit, obviously the printing business died because there were no exhibits. Right, exactly. There were no exhibits. And so that was like a reasonable amount of what I was doing for income. And I thought, okay, well, what else can I do that I really enjoy? And it was the books. And so I think last year, I did 7 or 8 books. So the last 2 or 3 years, I've really been concentrating on making books with a whole plethora of artists, some who are, more established, some less so, some that are self-published, some that are published by, indie publishers, some by larger publishers. And yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful process. And I sort of feel, I mean, everyone has different concerns, but now I think it used to be that you could put out a photo book, and if it was the reproductions were good, then it would be successful, or it had some chance of success in having some impact. But now that we've seen so much visual imagery, the book really needs to be more thoughtful. And I think every detail needs to be considered in order to be able to have a lot of impact. Because one of the things that books can really do when they're done, when they're well designed and considered, is that they're moving, sort of the pendulum of the photographer's or the artist's career. In addition to getting the work out there and getting them more well known. And of course, I mean, I think now books, for me, they need to be an experience. That should be the goal, is to try to create an experience. And that's done, through sort of course, the distribution of text and images and the visual language, the visual grammar, and those things. That it's basically what's included in those are like the typography, the color, what's the concept and the narrative of the work, the structure, the sequencing, and then how is that echoed and reflected in the design language. And when it comes together, then it's so much more powerful and makes so much more impact than if it's just something that's pretty on the page. So yeah.
Well, we should show a few of them, but like maybe because I would love to know a little bit about process, because we've been kind of going through some of the process as a 3-person team, looking at Sue's work, and it's very interesting too, the way that we've kind of all kind of played off of each other. And because I've taught a few workshops and we talk a good bit about sequencing and editing. And of course, you know, there's such a variety of things that you could use for sequencing and editing, and like, you know, absence of, like, you know, light and dark, or graphic elements, or theme, or mood, or tone, or narrative, like if you're trying to tell a specific story. Like, how do you kind of, I know it's hard to describe probably the process to go through some of that, but when you kind of are approaching work, because you've done enough probably now to maybe be able to speak to this, and it could be very individual, very much individual to project, but is there a way when you're kind of approaching these that you think about, like, how do you go about attacking the work to where it gets into the book form?
Yeah, so I think it's about sort of, there's not a specific set of steps for each book, but it's more sort of a thought process. And it really, for me, begins with, you know, dialogue with whoever the collaborators are, and getting to know the artist's work, both through what they speak about and what's written about the work and the work itself, and to sort of see what the surrounding projects are of the work. And for some projects, there can sort of be research that goes beyond that, into the subject matter, depending upon, you know, what kind of work it is. And so all of that then starts to build the scaffolding for what's going to become the visual language, and it needs to resonate with that original essence, I think. And if it doesn't, then it just doesn't have as much feeling.
Yeah. Well, show me a couple of the ones you keep it kind of adding, and I'm like, it's about the visual medium. So maybe
sure.
We can talk about examples and like what happened with them, because I know a lot of people are probably interested also in, you know, what's my next step? Like, I'm thinking about self-publishing, or maybe I want to work with a publisher, but I want to pick my own designer. I like Caleb's design a lot, you know, and are some publishers open to that? And have you found that some are not? And then where does your role end? And the handoff to the next role in the production process begin, if so. So maybe you can address some of those things in addition to, like, maybe just how you approach the work to produce the book that you produced, as you're showing some of these.
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer a few of those quickly, because
a lot of questions.
Talking, otherwise, I don't know if I have that capacity. I need another CPU upgrade.
And I need to write it all down. I'll write it all down.
But I think these days designers are pretty pivotal, because just making that pretty book is no longer going to have the effect that the photographer is hoping for in most cases. And like anything, you know, the more we practice something and the more time we spend in it, the more complex the thought process can be about it, and the more threads. I think when there's a lot of different threads that are rationally connected, that usually it's much more interesting in terms of for a book. And there's so many publishers now, which is really wonderful in many ways. But also the role of publishers have changed, because it used to be they would finance the projects, and in most cases that's no longer the reality. And so what it means is they're getting a lot of projects in front of them. Most of those projects are supplying funding. And so one has to differentiate your project. And the way to do that is really through the visual language. Like serving a stack of prints isn't usually what works anymore, whereas it used to in the past, and the publisher would sort through them. In terms of like designers and publishers, I mean, some publishers have in-house designers and some hire, you know, freelance designers. If I found usually in either case, because the budgets are so tight now, that the time process is going to be very short. So they may design a book in 2 weeks with the back and forths. And so it's just a very different experience, and it leads to a book it's hard to be thoughtful because there's not enough time to go into it to really understand the underlying
Huh. And
movement.
why do you think? Because like I've been, I mean, you know, I've worked with a few clients where the whole process, it's rare that it's been fast. And that might be also like, because when I try to work with them, we try to figure out, unless they, you know, are most definitely very secure in their funding. And even if they are, I still feel like there should be ways for you to raise funds to produce your book for your work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that might be sometimes why there's been even more of delay, and you know, and then you have to do with contract negotiations and figure a lot of that out, and then doing design, and so a lot of it probably, some of the delays has to do with just trying to get the funds together.
Yeah, sure.
But why do you think there's a rush that you've seen in some of the instances? Because that seems counter to some of the things that I've experienced.
Right.
Recently.
Well, for me, I think it's usually once the contract is signed, and you know, all of the money stuff is sorted out, because I mean, it really depends on the publisher again. So some of them have more time, but because books no longer, most publishers are not supported by book sales unless they're larger publishers. It means they have to get their funds elsewhere, and so the more that they're paying out, say for design or for production, that's, you know, the less money potentially in their pocket. And so that means that you might choose a different press than, you know, you would have previously. If you were printing 5,000 copies, it's one thing, and you know you're probably going to make, you know, a bunch of money because you can bring, the more you print in a book, the less each unit costs. And so it's the same with design. Like if you're going to spend, you know, 40 hours on it, it's going to cost less than if you spend 100 hours on it. And some of the, you know, some of the, like Phaidon, you know, they do excellent work. They hire a bunch of different freelance designers. And some of the photo ones, I mean, a lot of the ones that I respect more, it's usually coming from independent designers, even if they're published through, you know, a mid-size or indie publisher rather than in-house. Because it's just hard, you know, it's hard to spend so much time.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense, because like the longer you stretch it out, the probably more impactful it could be as far as the amount of hours actually spent doing the project.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
that makes sense. And if they still have systems in place, like you mentioned Phaidon, you know, they probably have systems in place for actually getting the production done, and they want to get it through the system, and they may be queued up at printers, or, you know, have other projects to design. Yeah, so maybe it's animal with different smaller publishers that I've dealt with.
Yeah, and Phaidon is one of the few that like really, of the large ones, I mean, they, you know, they print 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 copies usually at least. So, you know, they're still making money off of, or barely maybe. I mean, I think the whole publishing industry is tough, but, you know, they're surviving off of selling books. But for photographers, that's, you know, usually if you do a print run of 300 to 500, you can't cover the cost. And so, or it's very difficult to cover the cost. And so, you know, the purpose of a book has changed. I think I always recommend that even if you can break even or come close to break even, it's worth doing a book. And I feel like the movement internally also changes after doing a book, because if you spend a year working on it, like on developing the concept, the narrative, the design language, it influences like the future projects, and it makes the work stronger in the future because it's so well resolved. Yeah.
Okay, well, show me a couple of books.
Yeah, a couple of books.
Talking about things.
Okay. So let's see. Okay, I'll start.
And I'll ask questions as you hold some of those up.
Okay. So I'll show these three that were for spring that are now coming out here. So this is Marie Smith. It's, you know, a soft cover, nice and flexible. You can kind of see on the edge, maybe not on Zoom.
And is that printed black on the page? Oh yeah, it's printed black on the pages, right?
And then on the bottom, it's white, and the top, it's black. And so her book is basically about depression and racism. And she's a Black woman who lives in London, Black photographer, and it has a lot of text. And so the concept here was, it starts with all Black, And as you go through the book,
oh, wow.
the black slowly recedes, which is talking both to like the depression and dealing with that and feeling lighter by the end of the book than at the beginning. And then black and white can always deal with race, of course, which isn't very far. And then the type is also moving. So normally you do type at the, it comes from the top of the page, not from the bottom. And it's sort of moving like a graph as well to speak to the depression or the moods or the change in viewpoint of life. And so throughout, it's moving up and down. It's not at a constant, the columns aren't at a constant height. And so that's sort of what we figured out there. And
what's her name again? And the name of the book?
Marie Smith. The Fog Has Lifted. It's a KGP book, or Monolith. It's actually Monolith editions, this one. And so, part of it is also budget. If you're working with a publisher, I was working with a publisher here instead of the artist. The artist, of course, approved everything, but ultimately the publisher was my client. And this was to be a soft cover book, and it had a certain budget. And so this was a way to really bring in a visual language that echoed the work and gave the feeling, if you move through it, of what the text might be, because there's a lot of text almost every other page. And I think it's really wonderful text, and text that I wouldn't read much. I probably wouldn't have, come across had I not worked on this project of these issues. But if you just look at the images, you sort of can get a feeling for what the text is with all of that darkness, blackness. Yeah.
Oh, do you have another beside?
Yeah. So here's another one. This one is published by Henry Cornell Art, and it's Ode to the Lake, Sakalaya. I'm sure I'm butchering it. And
does it have die cut? Oh, it's printed on the back. But how many die cut are on the front? Is that?
Yeah, so there's
4 layers.
Yeah, exactly. There's 3 die cuts, and then the bottom layer.
Wow.
And the bottom layer, because you get a dust jacket to get that effect, actually has the lake again, which you would never know unless you opened it, which most people don't open. But that's what gives the black.
I love things hidden in flats.
It's fun. It's so fun to hide things. And so this is a book about like identity and for the photographer about his identity as a gay man, and growing up in Romania, he now lives in California, and how that affected him. And
can we see a little of the inside too?
Yeah. And so
there's some was there black and white pages in here too?
Yeah, so these are all tritones, and we printed this with a custom black.
Oh, wow.
So
where did you have this printed? Where was this one printed?
This is printed in Amsterdam, this one.
Oh, wow.
And everything, sorry.
Oh, sorry, no, the custom black, how did you decide that you needed a custom black on these?
So the idea was kind of to keep, since it's about a lake, and the lake is kind of a metaphor for struggling with our identity, especially when we're young. And our sexuality. So it all the black has some blue in it as well, that we had custom mixed. And the pages as you go kind of to reference water, the same as the cover. They get thinner as you go, which you can't really see on a zoom, but you have these different, some essays.
And were his prints just a little cooler? Is that why you went with the custom black?
It was really for the book.
So you chose to do it just to make it a little cooler or a little bluer.
A little bluer, yeah. And then the last is these very thin paper, which you can sort of get the translucent effect maybe behind it as you move.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And so then it introduces, a tactile element And like water, when you have different depths of water, you start to feel the pressure of the water above you more. And so sort of playing with that idea. And then the blues in there were printed with a blue PMS, because otherwise you can't get that intensity of blue, because traditionally you would mix cyan and magenta. You don't really get a true blue that way.
Did you work with the press? Did they make the suggestion, or did you work with like someone who did scan separations or like a lithographer? We're talking.
I mean, I think sometimes you can get, it's hard to find collaborators in production. At least that's what I found. And sometimes to the extent that even if you present something that is not going to come out well, I would say even most of the good presses often won't correct that, because it's kind of like these are the files you gave them, which is kind of another reason to work with somebody who has done more books, because really.
And photo books or art books.
And photo books, right, yeah, absolutely. And it can never be perfect, but you know, the problems can be smaller and smaller that arrive in the book until maybe they're not noticeable to most people. But yeah, so no, I mean, I knew we had that blue section, and so I knew I wanted it blue. And we worked with a lithographer on that to create those separations. And yeah.
Do you have one more book?
One more, yes. The third one. Okay. This is KGP. This is Amy Elkins. She photographed herself through COVID from the time that it began until she was injected. So there's, not sure what that is, 370 images, something like that. And the edges also are this very light blue. So it really starts to become sort of its own object.
And is that, did they color the block, or is that the paper? Is it the paper?
They colored the book block, yeah. It's colored. The edges, yeah. Wow. The head, the tail, and the foredge. And the book begins, you know, immediately. So they're all cyanotypes, thus, blue everywhere. And there's cyanotypes on cloth, the originals. And so the book just begins with no text, no title page. And there's about, I don't know, 15, 20 pages until you get to her essay, which is hard to do on Zoom, which then you get to her essay. And then the book continues. And then in order, when you have such a long book, I feel like it's necessary to figure out how to change the movement and the speed. And so one of the ways that we did this was to insert these little poems, fragments of poems. The full poems are at the back, and they're on this translucent, cyan paper, the cyanotypes. And so the text moves from forward to backwards. And you have this whole layering effect, which I feel like also talks about emulsion and talks about, the haptic nature of cyanotypes, which is very different than sort of the digital world.
And those were those glued in there? Like you were talking about?
No, they're all part of the signatures. So I'll show the last one too, because they kind of move into more complexity so that the type is now covering the type below it. And then it opens up. I don't know how readable any of this will be, but, which is really, I feel like, was a pretty nice usage of the typography.
Oh, wow, yeah, that's smart. Yeah, because they're 8 pages. They're part of the signatures, huh? That's beautiful.
Yeah, part of the signatures, yeah. And
really good idea.
One last fun little detail is also the thread is blue.
Oh, it's blue too.
It's blue. So, we have pretty much blue everywhere. And yeah, so that one, because also of its thickness and its size, instead of making a larger book, we decided to make a small book, which really, you can hold it in your hand, which makes it much more intimate for these portraits. And it also changes the proportions because it feels so, it is so thick. It's 470 pages, about 72, something like that. But it feels even thicker. And yeah, it feels very different than if it was a large book. And I think it's just sort of the perfect scale. And so you can really, with thicker books, it's easier to make them feel like these physical objects than the thinner books. There's sort of more to play with because there's more surfaces, because it's not really just the cover and the back cover, which is often what's thought about. It's also the edges of the book. And so all of these sides contribute to the outside of the book.
Yeah, and the size of it, like you were talking about, like when I talk to, when I do the workshop classes, I'll say, just go into bookstores and watch people look at books, and just see how they hold them. And then if they have to put something down and, is it really close or is it far away? And that one, like you said, there's an intimacy to it, because even though it's thick and probably kind of heavy for like the size, like the dimensions on the outside, it's you can still hold it in your hands and flip it. Even though you said it was kind of odd to do over Zoom, you were able to easily manage it and hold it,
right,
like while you were showing it, even just in that format. So you can kind of see how it can be held.
Yeah, and it's amazing, like all of the decisions change the end result. And so whether it's the thickness of the gray board is like the cover board that's for a hardcover book, you change the thickness, that changes the feeling. Or with this Amy Elkins book, having the edges painted is very different than not having the edges painted. Like it suddenly, when there's enough elements that work together, it becomes really cohesive. And suddenly it just has this impact and this presence and this feeling. And if you take away just one of those elements, it can lose all of that. All of the feeling can just vanish, which is kind of incredible. It's, all these small details.
Yeah, exactly. Even that first one that you showed, where the pages are printed, but it clearly makes it look black at the top. Is the book block colored on that one too, or is that's just from the paper, right?
Those are just from the paper, yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting though, because you didn't print the paper at the bottom, so it comes out white.
Exactly.
So all these elements that tie in together, that communicate what the book's about, what the work's about. I like to use the expression of, there's a lady in town in Santa Fe who owned a distillery, and you can go in and buy craft drinks that they've brewed, and then they brew them for other people too. But she says, she makes her staff go in and check the restroom, like every few times an hour and things like this. And she says, you may not know the reasons you like something, but you'll know the reasons why you don't. So it's good to like try and think of as many of those reasons that you possibly can to make the object as perfect for communicating what you want to communicate. But they'll know the things that are wrong for sure. So, but if it all kind of binds together and communicates the general idea, then
then it's wonderful. And to have, to invite curiosity, because I think often I feel that there's this intention so much on what it will do for the artist rather than what it's going to do for the audience. And if everything is crystal clear and legible, then there's no participation from the audience. But if the audience, if you have a tightrope, and if the audience has to come 20% of the way in order to understand it, then they're much more involved. And they give the gift of their time, because that's really the most valuable thing. Many of us, most of us, all of us, maybe, since we have a limited amount of time. Yeah. And so by inviting them to participate, or trying to invite them to participate, then the level of engagement is going to be higher. But then that's sort of the sign of creating an experience. Because if it's just all laid out and you sit there passively, the audience, at least I don't like engaging in books like that, right? Yeah. So I know when there's a little bit of puzzle, or that's why it's fun to find something underneath a dust jacket, or to look at a cover and then understand why that cover, exists as it does. I have, just really quickly, so this one, it's called Sleepover Secrets. I don't know if you can tell, but it says sleep dash over. And so it's just this little play on sleeping over, and you're going over the book down to the bottom, and then everything's in one line. and it's sort of made like a notebook with a little rubber band. And so if there can just be these little
tiny
moments,
elements, thoughtful, very thoughtful elements. And then I think about going, if it is it on my bookshelf, and what does the spine look like? Or is it going to visit Photo Eye recently, going back to my old haunts and Photo Eye and just looking at all the books on display, and then looking at the ones that are spine out, some of which, probably many of which I don't see as often now, that I'm not there as I used to. It's like you are competing for attention, and how do you engage someone? And then once they take it home, which they bought it, granted, but you still kind of want them to engage more and more so with the book. So it's like, how do you create that through all of the options that you have, through your spine and through your cover, and then by content as well. So yeah, I think it can be, I'm much more object oriented, I think, when it comes to a book, but it has to be intentional and purposeful instead of just being the nature of like the designer kind of going crazy, which some people develop a style and they end up doing it and they're not quite as thoughtful with each project. Some designers do that, but
I mean,
names, and I'm not talking about you.
no, I mean, it's, each project, it's funny because I feel like each project is a continuation in one way of the thinking process of visual language, of typography, of color, and each project starts fresh. And so these two maybe seemingly paradoxical in one way statements are both true. And it's all one long line of thought in a way. My first book to these books, but there's hopefully there's an evolution. I mean, for me, if there's not an evolution, then that sort of becomes a very sad day, because then it becomes work, right? Yeah. That's kind of the definition of work, is that we just do it. You take the classic job that's repetitive, and then it's not as interesting, of course. And so if we can always hone our skills, whether we're photographers or whether we're editors, as you are, or designers or writers, but to always try to push the medium forward, I think is really interesting. And then collaboration. We haven't talked much about collaboration, but collaboration is really the cornerstone of it all, because if you just take a book and throw images on a page, it's never really going to be that interesting. I mean, the images may be fantastic, but the overall experience isn't going to be very meaningful. And I think, again, because we have so many books, it's very important now to create books that are really well discussed, well researched, and where the collaboration is very strong, and the intention is clear, and all of the elements of the visual language. So yeah, it's an exciting time, because there are so many books, and because people can do 300 books on a wet press, not on a digital press. It didn't used to be like that. It used to be they wanted 1,000 minimum.
And it's slowly gone down, but the fact that I was surprised about that when you said that too, about 300 on offset, it's almost like they had to adjust to the market too a little bit. So so that was great, because it's also good to know your audience and how many you can sell ideally, or give away if you're going to go that route, but how many you can actually sell. So
and I think I feel like so many people, I know when I had my books published, often the first question people would ask is, either like, how did you get the publisher? But also up there was, how many copies? And I never felt like that was a relevant question, because it's about, in terms of that, it's about what audience does it reach, and how does it change our own development and our future projects as artists? And of course, what effect does it have on our career? That's another question that maybe people don't want to talk about, because it's sort of shunned in the arts, but books affect careers, period. Like every book I've ever worked on has generated, press and moved move the positioning of the photographer, both in the public's mind and also in their own mind, which then allows them to create a different kind of work.
Well, it's a completely different vehicle, like you were talking about earlier. Exhibitions are there and they can travel, but it's still very limited. Whereas, a book object can go much further. So it allows the work to travel a lot further and be seen by a lot more people.
Yeah. And when the person does buy that book and they bring it home, sometimes it will go on the shelf, but for the people who don't collect 100 photo books, it goes on the table often.
For not us.
Not us. So you don't want us buying your book. No, I'm kidding. I know I need more bookshelf space. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, me too.
But
well, this was great, and I think I could probably ask you a lot more questions. And we've gotten not deep into the mire of philosophy of photo books a little bit. We could probably talk a little bit deeper about it, but I think we kind of started. It was kind of like a little nice ebb and flow between the technical aspects and philosophical aspects of like book design. So yeah, that's what I do like about conversing with you when we've been working together so far. So thanks so much.
Yeah, I look forward to working with you more. And I think we're both open to collaborations on future books.
Definitely, yeah.
I think we both love working with, artists and photographers and really helping to sculpt, that visual language and the sequencing and the editing and the typography. I feel like typography is so key also to a successful book.
That could be a whole workshop probably in itself. Probably.
Yeah. Maybe we should do one together.
Yeah. Not a bad idea. Maybe here we go. Go to our websites. It's tomorrow. Right. Yeah. So it's CalebCainMarcus.com. Is that your website?
That's my photo one. And then luminositylab.com is my design.
Okay. All right. Well, fantastic. Thanks so much for meeting with me today. And then I'll see you soon.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me, Melanie.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Bye.